Welcome to Teaching to the Top Advanced Depth and Complexity Boot Camp. We'll spend about the next hour and a half, 2 hours, going over the content as this is a flipped session. And then I will see you for 45 minutes during GiftED20, which will be a wonderful virtual conference. My name is Clint Rodriguez. I will be your host for the next several minutes. A little bit about me. Currently, I serve as the Region 11 ESC Gifted and Talented and Advanced Academics Consultant. Prior to that, I worked in Richardson ISD as their district-wide secondary GT and advanced academics specialist, did that for a couple of years. And before that, I was a humanities teacher at Aspire Academy for the highly gifted in Grapevine, Colleyville ISD. The rest of my teaching career was at Heritage Middle School, where I taught GT English, Avid, creative writing, and a couple of other things. Before that, I was in a PhD program at the University of Florida for about 4 years. Teaching and writing, I decided that I did not like that, so I went ahead and came back to Texas and got certified, and I have been working in gifted education ever since, and gifted education is pretty much my favorite thing in the world. If you would like to know a little bit more about me, my alignments are listed at the bottom of the screen for you. For you Harry Potter fans, I am a Ravenclaw. If you happen to be a Dungeons and Dragons person, I am a chaotic neutral. I'm an ENTP as far as Briggs Myers goes, which is the debater, which will surprise no one who knows me. I don't believe in astrology, but I am very much a Sagittarius, and if anybody remembers those color personality things they made all of us do several years ago, I am a green, so my apologies to all of the blues out there in the audience. Right off the bat, I want to make you aware of the resources that are available to you. If you click on this first link here, it will take you to the slide deck just so that you can have your own copy and follow along with what I'm talking about as I talk about it. The other thing that you're going to want to be aware of will be this folder here, which is full of tons of resources that I have been working on over the past several years. So much of what we're going to be talking about today is housed in this folder, along with a whole bunch of other stuff that we are not going to be talking about. So all of this is available to you for free. So I would definitely keep that link handy because there's just a whole bunch of good stuff in this folder. Next thing I'd like to talk about are our objectives. There's only one of them, and it is to implement the icons of depth and complexity and the content imperatives in more deep, broad, and complex ways. One of my goals with this session is to go beyond the surface level with these really great tools of depth and complexity and show you a bunch of different strategies that can maybe take them a little bit farther and get you a little bit more bang for your buck when you are using the icons in your classroom in terms of rigor and challenge and level of thinking with your students. Why are we here? Well, there are several reasons. I will speak for long periods of time about how wonderful I think that the icons of depth and complexity are. I incorporated them in my own classroom, and they transformed my teaching and they transformed the learning of my students. I implemented them with my teachers in Richardson, and they sang the praises of depth and complexity. And I really think that depth and complexity is one of those great tools that has obviously been around for a pretty long time, but it never gets old, and it remains very versatile, and it's incredibly easy to implement and use. There's no reinvention of the wheel. There is no new flashy technology that teachers have to become familiar with in order to be successful. Depth and complexity really is just the incorporation of these higher level thinking skills deliberately into lesson planning and the designing of learning experiences. Depth and complexity was also probably a little bit ahead of its time. If you think of the icons of depth and complexity as this visual system, well, it really does presage all of the visual culture that our kids are embedded in and living in now. So if you think about how kids communicate, it is through emoji and bitmoji and TikTok and video and all of these other visual cues. And so the icons of depth and complexity really kind of almost predicted that. And as a result, they're very easy to embed into the learning of today's children because children are already very used to thinking in these ways. So that's sort of the why behind depth and complexity. Like I said, what I'm very much more interested in for this particular session is to give you some tools that don't just use the icons as surface level lenses, but really use the icons to their full potential, to bring out the depth and complexity of depth and complexity. So before we get started, I know that this says Advanced Depth and Complexity Bootcamp, but it may be that some of you out there in the audience are new to depth and complexity. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about what it is, just to catch any of those of you up who are unfamiliar with it, and I think you'll be able to catch on pretty quickly. The icons of depth and complexity are a system of higher order thinking skills comprising these 11 icons and these 5 content imperatives that were added later. So over here with the lips, you have the language of the discipline, details, patterns. This sort of org chart looking things is rules, of course. Then you have trends, unanswered questions. One of my favorite icons here is ethics, then big idea, change over time, multiple perspectives, another favorite of mine, and then across the disciplines or interdisciplinary thinking. Then in terms of the content imperatives, these sort of darker black and white ones, you have origin, you have contribution, convergence, parallel, and paradox. So with Sandra Kaplan and Betty Gould were coming up with this stuff as a system for meeting the needs of gifted and talented kids. One of the things that they did was talk to a bunch of content experts and try to identify any commonalities in how those content experts thought and talked about the areas of their expertise, and this is what they came up with. So the icons of depth and complexity are not curriculum. They are not content. They are a system of higher order thinking skills used by content experts that are tied to images to be used in conjunction with the standard curriculum in order to increase the depth, breadth, and complexity of student learning. So it's not content. These are just lenses through which you can examine content more deeply. And we're going to do a lot of practice with that in just a second here. It's also worth noting that depth and complexity is mentioned by name in the Texas State Plan for the Education of Gifted and Talented Students. We offer at the Service Center a kind of very surface level training, just kind of introducing the icons one at a time, and then I offer some more in-depth trainings looking at combinations of icons and things like that. So this particular training that you're here for TAGT is really kind of the greatest hits of a lot of the stuff that I've been doing in my regular role. Okay, there are 2 ways of approaching the introduction of the depth and complexity icons. Sandra Kaplan recommends pretty specifically to do it via baby steps, and we are going to be doing baby steps a little bit later. But I would like to start out by throwing you into the deep end. So there's 2 approaches. I would say probably the deep end approach is one that you would get away with some older kids who can maybe think a little bit more nimbly about these things, whereas the baby steps, of course, is going to be more in line with what you would do for younger kids, maybe with kids who do not speak English as their first language. And I would like to kind of backtrack just a little bit and say that one of the great things about depth and complexity is that, yes, it was invented for gifted and talented learners, but there is nothing about it that would make it impossible to implement with children who are learning at pretty much any level. It is very easy to scaffold. For students who are on level, it's easy to scaffold for students who may be struggling a little bit with their learning. And it also, because it is visual, lends itself very well to the teaching of our English learners as well. So all kids really are capable of this kind of thinking. It really is just a matter of pacing and scaffolding and things like that. So we're going to start with the deep end, and we're going to talk about depth and complexity just by kind of giving you a bit of a crash course, and we'll do a couple of activities. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to need to do is really kind of refamiliarize ourselves or introduce ourselves, if we're new to depth and complexity, to all of the 11 icons and all of the content imperatives. So if you come over here to this bit.ly and click on it, it will take you to a place where it asks you to make a copy of something called the Expanded, New, and Improved Depth and Complexity one-pager. So you're going to click Make a Copy. Sometimes it takes a minute. And lo and behold, you have your very own copy of this one-pager, which is in fact actually about 6 pages. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what this one-pager is designed to do and what it is meant for in terms of being a resource. So you have all of these different columns, and you can see it's quite lengthy, but I did include all of the icons and I did include all of the content imperatives. So over here in the far left-hand corner, you have the icon of depth and complexity and the name of that icon. So you have your lips here, those stand for language of the discipline. All right. Then what we have over here in the very next column is the definition of language of the discipline. And you'll notice that it's quite a lengthy definition. There is more than one way to think about language of the discipline. So yes, we can say that it is the specialized vocabulary and terminology specific to a discipline or community, language used by insiders and experts, which of course implies that there are also outsiders, which means that it's also understanding how language can exclude people. Okay, so that's kind of the definition piece. And then over here in this third column, what I have are a bunch of key words that also relate to language of the discipline. So when we think about language of the discipline, for example, we're not just talking about academic vocabulary. We're not just talking about what, if you're using a textbook, what kids would find in the glossary. We're also thinking about stuff like acronyms. And if you think about how many acronyms in teaching there are, it becomes pretty apparent early on that we do have quite a bit of that in terms of jargon, slang that people use, buzzwords. We have a whole lot of those in educations as well. But also talking about, for example, things like giving your tools the right name, right? So if you think about it this way, if you are a science teacher, there are multiple things in your science lab that could be not inaccurately called a jar. But the fact of the matter is that each of those jars has a specialized purpose, and with that specialized purpose comes a specialized name. So it's not a jar, it's a beaker, or it's an Erlenmeyer flask, or it's a graduated cylinder, right? So it's all about giving tools their right names, okay? So then is where it kind of gets a little bit more in depth. We've got our definition, we've got our keywords. Over here though, in the fourth column, and this is going to be very important later on, what I've done is I've kind of selected for each of the icons just one of the 4 core disciplines. And then I have used my icon as a lens through which to view that discipline and then write a higher level question. So this first example with language of the discipline, what I've got here is I was thinking of science as my discipline, more specifically biology. So I'm using the language of the discipline depth and complexity lens to think about biology. And the higher level question that I come up with is, what words would a biologist use to describe cellular reproduction in the clearest and most accurate way possible? Okay, so just kind of jump down to another example down here. Let's come over to ethics, ethics being my favorite icon. So I've got my icon and I've got my name for my icon here. I have my definition here. I have my keywords that are basically synonyms for when we're talking about ethics. We're talking about a lot of different kinds of things. And then I'm using my ethics lens as, let's say, maybe I was an English teacher who was doing a film study on The Lion King. So I'm using my ethics lenses to view The Lion King, and the higher level sample question I come up with is the behavior of the hyenas in The Lion King morally excusable or at least understandable? So it really is important to, as much as possible, combine the icon with a higher level command word. Okay, so in this case, students are being asked to evaluate. The same thing up here with language of the discipline and science. We are asking students not just to describe cellular reproduction using language of the discipline, but to do it in the clearest and most accurate way possible, which takes them to about the level of Bloom's, or about the level of, I should say, evaluate on Bloom's, right? So we want to make sure that we're marrying that icon to a higher level thinking skill. Then these last 4 columns, what I wanted to do, and I kind of came up with some of this on my own, and I stole it from other places and just really tried to look around and see where I could find ways that very specifically each of the icons fit in with different topics and different ideas across the four core. Okay, so some icons obviously lend themselves very well to English and social studies. Other icons, for example, maybe patterns and rules, identify very well with math and science. But I wanted to, as much as possible, give everybody out there in the audience lots of different ways of thinking about how each of these icons fit into their specific discipline, whatever their discipline may be. So that's the one pager. What I'm going to encourage you to do now is pause the video and take a few minutes to look through the icons and the content imperatives and identify your four favorite. Okay, and it may be that you just like the colors, and so you say, you know, I really like this purple, so I'm going to choose language of the discipline. Or it may be that they really just speak to whatever it is that you teach, or you know, the kinds of questions that you like to ask. Okay, so for example, if I was picking my four favorite icons, I would pick paradox. I absolutely love paradox as a former social studies and English teacher. I also really love multiple perspectives. I love big idea, and I love ethics. So I'm going to look through this page if I'm you over there in the audience, and I'm going to choose my four favorite icons, and I'm going to kind of hold those in my head for this next part. A couple of other things to be apprised of is that I do have several other resources listed here. So J. Taylor Education is, of course, where you can go to number one, find yourself some free downloadable JPEG icons. They've been very generous to provide those for teachers free of charge. But there's also a ton of other stuff on their website, just in terms of paid materials that are quite high quality. In fact, I actually just gave my sister a set of their Q3 cards to use with my niece as she's doing her remote learning to help her maybe differentiate at home a little bit more. Gifted Guru, free downloads of frames. We are going to talk very briefly about frames. I didn't want to spend too much time on frames during this training, just because a lot of you, if you're coming to this as an advanced depth and complexity practitioner, you've probably seen frames. But if you're new, you can click here, and Lisa Van Gimmert has provided a whole bunch of free stuff very generously. Envision Gifted is a great place to go for depth and complexity, particularly if you are looking for ways to combine icons. So we're going to talk a little bit about combining icons a little bit later in the training, but they've done a lot of the pre-work for you. So Envision Gifted is another great resource. And then, of course, birdseed.com. Ian Bird has a whole bunch of stuff for depth and complexity practitioners, and has lots of great little articles explaining, you know, the different icons. And you could even use these articles with your kids as a way of introducing them as you're defining what each of the icons means. Finally, I want to show you this, which is a copy of a depth and complexity lesson plan. So this was actually made by some teachers who came to one of my trainings not too long ago. They were science teachers, and we'll talk about how you embed the icons of depth and complexity just a little bit later. But I wanted you to, you know, see that it is possible and that it doesn't have to be anything too extravagant. Nobody has you know, used a dog or a pony to put on a show here. Nobody's reinvented the wheel. It really is just a solid lesson plan tied to the standards, as you can see. So that's another resource for you. And again, I encourage you to download your own copy of the slideshow, because it will have these links on there for you to click on. Finally, before I forget, Ian Bird's differentiator is, of course, one of everybody's favorite tools that he has created. And it is, in terms of creating activities for kids to do, he's put, in terms of the content here, all of the different depth and complexity skills, the imperatives, and then also some keywords over here that don't have their own icons. So if you are thinking about, you know, how am I going to embed these icons into an activity for my kids to do, the differentiator will help you quite a bit with that particular task. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and, like I said, jump into the deep end. And that involves, looking back at that one pager, that expanded one pager, kind of pick your four favorite icons, and we're going to read a story together. So the story that I selected was Aesop's The Animals and the Plague. I felt like it was pretty on the nose just in terms of the times that we are living in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this link down here and I'm going to read the story out loud to you. And what I'm going to be doing as I'm reading the story is I'm going to be using one of the icons that I chose as a lens through which to read this story. Okay, so ethics is my favorite icon, so I'm going to put my ethics glasses on as we read this story, and I'm going to be looking for phrases, quotations, sentences, passages that really seem to stick out in terms of maybe raising ethical concerns or questions. So you can read it with whatever icon you chose out of the four that you decided were your favorite. Just know that I'm going to be reading it through the lens of ethics. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it. It's going to take us over to the Library of Congress website, which, by the way, has all of these stories for free. So if you are an English teacher or you want to incorporate this into, your myths and legends unit, by all means, it's a great resource. So I'm going to go ahead and read this out loud. I hope you enjoy it. Remember, I am reading it using the lens of ethics. Okay, so, excuse me. The Animals and the Plague. Once upon a time a severe plague raged among the animals. Many died, and those who lived were so ill that they cared for neither food nor drink, and dragged themselves about listlessly. No longer could a fat young hen tempt Master Fox to dinner, nor a tender lamb rouse greedy Sir Wolf's appetite. At last the lion decided to call a council. When all the animals were gathered together, he arose and said, "Dear friends, I believe the gods have sent this plague upon us as a punishment for our sins. Therefore, the most guilty one of us must be offered in sacrifice. Perhaps we may thus obtain forgiveness and cure for all. I will confess all my sins first. I admit that I have been very greedy and have devoured many sheep. They had done me no harm. I have eaten goats and bulls and stags. To tell the truth, I even ate up a shepherd now and then. Now, if I am the most guilty, I am ready to be sacrificed, but I think it best that each one confess his sins as I have done. Then we can decide in all justice who is the most guilty." "Your Majesty," said the fox, "you are too good. Can it be a crime to eat sheep, such stupid mutton heads? No, no, your Majesty, you have done them great honor by eating them up. And so far as shepherds are concerned, we all know they belong to that puny race that pretends to be our masters." All the animals applauded the fox loudly. Then, though the tiger, the bear, the wolf, and all the savage beasts recited the most wicked deeds, all were excused and made to appear very saint-like and innocent. It was now the ass's turn to confess. "I remember," he said guiltily, "that one day as I was passing a field belonging to some priests, I was so tempted by the tender grass and my hunger that I could not resist nibbling a bit of it. I had no right to do it, I admit." A great uproar among the beasts interrupted him. Here was the culprit who had brought misfortune on all of them. What a horrible crime it was to eat grass that belonged to someone else. It was enough to hang anyone for, much more an ass. Immediately they all fell upon him, the wolf in the lead, and soon had made an end of him, sacrificing him to the gods then and there, and without the formality of an altar. And the moral of this story is that the weak are made to suffer for the misdeeds of the strong. So there's the story, pretty good story, back from a time when it was okay to traumatize kids a little bit, I guess. But as I said, I was reading this story with my lens of depth and complexity. So, and that lens was ethics, right? So this whole story kind of deals with ethics, but I'm looking through here and kind of thinking, okay, what really sticks out to me when I'm using that ethics lens in terms of a passage or a sentence? And so I'm going to pick down here, and I'm going to say, all the savage beasts recited the most wicked deeds. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to copy it. And then we're going to do something with this quote. All right, so I'm back over in the main slide deck, and we've read this story, and I read this story using my ethics lens, and I selected a quote and I copied it, and I'm going to paste that quote somewhere in just a second here. But what I want to do first is sort of show you what we're going to do using these lenses of depth and complexity to read this story, right? To review and examine this content. So what we're going to be doing is using depth and complexity to engage text. Now, we chose a piece of fiction, or I should say I chose a piece of fiction. Obviously, you're going to choose reading that fits with your content, okay? So if you are a history teacher or social studies teacher, obviously, primary, secondary sources. If you're a science teacher, it could be a scientific article. If you're a math teacher, you could even do it with word problems, right? Kids tend to struggle with those. But as an old English teacher, I'm going to stick with fiction, which is my first love. And what I've done here is I've used these ethics icons and multiple perspective icons, unanswered questions, and big idea as lenses to think about story. Okay, so I looked at The Hobbit and I used ethics as my lens, and the higher level question that I came up with using my ethics lens to view the story of The Hobbit was killing Smaug an ethical mission, given that he is very likely the last of his kind? So again, it's a higher level question because I'm asking kids to evaluate the morality of a certain action within that story. Then we hop over here to multiple perspectives. I used my multiple perspective lens to look at Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. And so the question I came up with there was, does Captain Beatty have a point about free expression being a slippery slope? Then I use unanswered questions to talk about A Wrinkle in Time, one of the unanswered questions in A Wrinkle in Time, and I don't remember if it's answered in subsequent books, but where does it originate, and does it matter? So the evil brain thing, where did it come from? And then finally over here, I used Big Idea to, I don't know why I'm laughing. Well, I do know why I'm laughing. I used Big Idea as my lens to look at The Outsiders, and the question that I came up with was, is it actually possible to stay gold given the state of the world? Ponyboy. Okay, so that's kind of how you do it. You use these depth and complexity icons as lenses. And then what I did was I looked back at the story, I grabbed my quote, and then I set up all of these slides where what you have are the icons, okay, and you can do this with kids, and I'm going to show you what it looks like in just a minute here. And all of the icons have a couple of spaces to include a quote from the story and then also to write a question about that story. So I've got that all set up here with all of the depth and complexity icons and the content imperatives. And what I would do if I was a teacher is I would create this slide deck and then I would push it out to the kids, and then the kids can actually edit it, right? So if you're in Google, you want to make sure that your share settings are unrestricted. So in this case, if I'm sending it out to kids, anyone with the link, and then of course can edit. And your kids are sitting here looking at this slide deck. They go, they've selected their favorite icons, and they just go find their icon. And like I said, I chose ethics, and I'm going to pretend I'm a kid here, and I'm going to open up myself a text box, and I'm going to go ahead and drop in the quote that I found that I felt had to deal with ethics. Okay, and obviously I'm going to want to change the font size and all of that. You will want to, set up rules for your kids about, who gets to write on the slide and when and all of that stuff. So I've got my quote here. Don't really want it highlighted. There we go. And then I'm going to think about, okay, so this quote has a lot to do with ethics, which was my lens that I'm using. Well, now what I want to do is I want to write a higher level question that quote brings up. Okay, so maybe my question is something like, is it fair to judge animals as savage when they are acting according to their nature? Okay, so now as a a teacher, I'm letting my kids work on this slide deck and get all their questions on there. So, number one, they can see all the questions that their peers are writing, but then you, as a teacher, also have this great bank of questions that has just been created by your kids, and it shows you the depth that they are using as they're approaching the story. So, this is the digital version of it, where you would have the kids just kind of editing the slides on their own. But there is also, once COVID-19 is done, if it's ever done, a way to do this physically, right? So in this case, what I did was I just provided, and my audience here was teachers, I provided them with chart paper. I had the icons printed out and cut out for them, and I gave them, markers and glue. And then I just grabbed a copy of, the Dallas Morning News for everybody on the way to work that morning. And I said, okay, go find as a group a story that speaks to you, and go ahead and cut that story out, and then you go use those icons. In this case, I had them working with all of the icons, not just their four favorite. Use those icons as lenses through which to view these newspaper stories, and then, using those lenses, you can generate some questions. And then they just sort of did a little bit of a round robin gallery walk so that they could see the thinking that they had been doing with those icons based on those stories. So there's a digital way to do it, and there is a physical way to do it. Probably we're going to be sticking to digital for the foreseeable future, but there is also a way of doing it so it's a little bit more tactile. Okay. That first example that we looked at in terms of throwing folks into the deep end with their exploration of depth and complexity is really focused on very specific content. So we're just looking at one short story, we're just looking at one article, one book chapter, one word problem. But I did want to make you aware of another resource which allows students to apply depth and complexity to broader content. Okay, so this is something called the depth and complexity for review and reflection. So if we come down here and click on this link, it will take us to, again, another opportunity to make a copy. And here we go. So depth and complexity for review and reflection. So I imagine this as a way for students to kind of think about the bigger picture in terms of whatever discipline or class they are in. So there are some steps here where, they review a one-pager. This is a slightly pared down version of the big one that you got at the beginning. And so they're going to take some time to reflect on what they have learned about whatever subject it is you teach. And so this could be before a test, it could be before the end of the semester, anything like that, right? So it's review and reflection. We're thinking about broad topics at this point, not stuff as specific as a story like The Animal and the Plague. And so then what they do is they come down here and they have these very broad questions that are keyed on the different icons. So I have a sample here for science. The icon is language of the discipline. The essential question that I have them ask is, okay, why is it so important to know scientific terminology? And then they would record their own thoughts. They're going to be working with a peer. And so they're each going to be sort of thinking about it. And again, you can just, share this with them, allow them to make their own copy and make it editable. And then just type in on the document socially distanced, right? So they each record their thoughts, then they have a conversation trying to synthesize a big idea from their thoughts up here. So my thoughts for this were, depending on the kind of science being practiced, scientists use a variety of vocabulary specific to their subfield. And then my imaginary peer said, scientific language is different from the language used by lay people to describe the same things because science is very concerned with precision. And so then these two individuals would then try to synthesize a big idea from their individual thoughts. So what they came up with was, in order to ensure accuracy and precision, scientists use different vocabulary than non-scientists, and that vocabulary is important what vocabulary is important depends on what kind of science is being practiced. And then any lingering questions that they might have for, discussion or, asking the teacher. So the lingering questions here were, how is scientific vocabulary formulated? how can scientists communicate effectively with the general public, given that they do use that very specific vocabulary. So what I've done here is, again, the subject is whatever it is you teach, and you're using the lens, the icon of depth and complexity to think about that subject. So you've got here for language of the discipline, what is the most important vocabulary you learned this year or this semester? How will it serve you in the future? For details, what makes this subject different from others? What are the most important aspects of this subject not shared by other subjects? For patterns, what are the most interesting, important patterns that emerge in my study of this subject throughout the year? Let's skip down a little bit here. Let's jump to ethics, because ethics is my favorite. What are the most pressing moral and ethical concerns raised by this subject? And then what controversies exist within it? So you don't have to, I don't have to read all of them. You have access to this and you can kind of look over it. But again, you can use depth and complexity as a tool for being very, very specific in terms of content, or you can use it to be much broader, right? So these questions here that I've written are really concerned not with specific units or passages or activities. It really is, let's think about science in the broader subject, in the bigger picture, I should say. Let's think about English language arts in the bigger picture, right? As opposed to focusing so much on the more minute stuff, right? So it's a way of having kids think globally about whatever discipline it is they are learning, and that you are teaching them. Okay. The next thing that I want to draw your attention to is something that I came up with called the Depth and Complexity Quick Draw game. We are not obviously going to be playing the game. Just know that it kind of exists, and what we're really going to get out of it is using the lenses again to be subject specific, right? To use these lenses of depth and complexity to think about some of these topics. Okay, so if you click here, it will take you to a folder with all different kinds of stuff. So we're really just going to kind of focus on these things over here, the topic cards, but there is a game board, there is a score sheet, there is a set of rules over here. I'm not going to tell you that the rules make a whole lot of sense. I have had teachers kind of beta test this, and they've done their own tweaks to the rules just to make it flow a little bit better. I am not a game designer, so I make no claims to it being, the best thing since Uno. Although it was modeled on Uno, I don't know how effective it is. But what we're really going to be focusing on here are these topic cards and these task cards. So what you would do is, if I can get these to open, is you would have these topic cards. Now, I wrote my topic cards with the idea that they would be used by adults, okay? You would come up with your own discipline-specific topic cards, and you would come up with those topic cards based on, number one, what are the standards that you need to teach? What's the vocabulary? You could even come up with these topic cards using just language of the discipline and all of your academic vocabulary. So it has to be subject specific. I just chose stuff that I thought adults would have fun talking about. You obviously don't want to get in trouble, so you wouldn't be using my topic cards. Okay, so anyway, here are the topic cards. And the next thing, in addition to the topic cards, is going to be these quick draw cards. So what you have here are these task cards that are, you've got your icons here, and then what they're telling you is that when you draw this icon card, you're either going to be coming up with a question related to that icon or a statement related to that icon as it relates to what you drew on the topic card. So let's take a look at what this looks like, just a little bit broken down. Okay. So let's say that you're playing this game, and the first topic card that you draw is book bans. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do after you have drawn this topic card is take a moment to consider what you know about the topic of book bans, and also what your initial feelings on book bans are. So I'm going to give, whoever draws that topic card a chance to process, right? So if you're playing in a group of 3 or 4 or whatever, one person draws the book ban cards, they're going to be doing the processing. The other kids in the group are going to be doing the processing as well. And they're going to be thinking, okay, what do I know about book bans? Do I know very much? Do I know a little? Do I know a lot? And then, how do I feel about that, right? So I'm really kind of thinking with my gut right now, okay? But then I draw one of those task cards. All right, so let's say that I drew the ethics icon card, and now what I have to do is relate ethics to book bans. Okay, so I'm going to use my icon as a lens through which to view that topic, and I'm going to come up with a statement or a question based on whether my task card had a question mark or an ellipsis. I'm going to come up with a statement or a question that connects that topic to the icon. So I'm having to do a little bit more thinking now. I'm using the ethics task card to clarify my thinking about book bans. So, let's say that my initial feeling about book bans is that I'm pretty much against them. But if I'm thinking about, maybe being a little bit contrarian, or maybe I process a little bit better, maybe the statement that I come up with is something that I don't necessarily totally believe, but that's okay, because what we're trying to do is make our thinking more rigorous and more nimble. So again, I had that ethics task card plus that topic card of book bans. I had to think about it. And so what I come up with and what I present to the group is the following statement and question. Sometimes it is necessary to ban books and other art because they might introduce dangerous ideas into the public sphere. For example, is freedom of speech so important that we should continue to allow the publication of Mein Kampf? Okay, so I, as the initial player, have drawn those two cards. I set out my statement. I kind of present it to the group, and then the group discusses. The group has, a polite fight, a debate, something of that nature. Okay, so we might try it one more time. Take a moment to consider what you know about this topic and what your initial feelings are. And then, of course, we're going to draw that depth and complexity task card. This time we've drawn paradox. And I'm going to have to come up with a statement or a question that connects the topic to the icon. And maybe what I come up with is something along the lines of how do we weigh the necessity of protecting endangered species against the necessity of protecting economic development. So I always think of that old case of the owls and the timber cutters, right? So who has more moral standing? Is it the animals that lived there first, or is it the loggers who require that timber to continue making their living and feeding their families? So we started out by kind of jumping into the deep end, just letting you look at all of the icons, kind of absorb them, and then put those icons to use as lenses through which to view our various disciplines. Okay, so that's kind of the fast and furious way to do it. Probably works pretty well with older kids. That's kind of what I did with my 6th and 7th graders. But now we're going to slow it down. And we're going to take baby steps. And this is actually the approach that Sandra Kaplan recommends. And it has 5 initial steps, and then you kind of just repeat those steps with each of the icons. So what she recommends is, you introduce 1 or 2 icons a week. You may slow it down even more if you are working with younger kids, so you introduce the icon saying, hey kids, this week, or, this 6 weeks, we're going to use the ethics icon as our tool for thinking about all the wonderful stuff that we're going to learn. Okay, so you kind of use it as your lens, and you may be recursive with it, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So you introduce the icon, you do it very, very slowly, really no more than 1 a week if you're working with little kids. And the first thing that you're going to do after you've introduced the icon and the visual is very important, because remember, it allows kids to kind of key on almost that Pavlovian symbol, right? I see the black and white diamond. I know that I'm thinking about ethics. That's the thinking skill that I'm going to be using. So then you define the icon, all right? So you say, okay, here's what ethics means to me. What does ethics mean to you? Let's take a look at what it says in the dictionary, all these different definitions of ethics, like let's see how other people think about ethics. And then you would kind of, as a class, maybe come up with your own definition of ethics that you would have, somewhere displayed in the classroom. And it's also important to note that that definition can shrink, it can expand. It needs to be a flexible definition based on what you learn about ethics as it relates to your content. Okay, so you introduce the icon. You define that icon, lots of different definitions, and then you tie that icon to previous knowledge or content. Okay, so you spend some time, here's how ethics related to what we talked about last week, right? So you have the kids at a point of confidence where, they know this past content, which is going to make it easier for them to tie in this new thinking skill. All right, once you've done that, then you can apply that icon to new content, right? So, we've tied it back to what we learned last week. Here's what we're learning this week. Where do you see the ethical questions and concerns being raised by this new content? And how do you feel about that? What should we make of that? All right. And then finally, you apply the icon to the real world. Okay, so you've learned this new thinking skill. You've done lots of different learning techniques with it, embedding it in old content and then embedding it in new content. Now let's apply it to the real world beyond, the classroom walls, beyond, your individual home. All right. And then you repeat with each of the icons. So it's a very deliberate process. It goes very, very slowly, and you give kids lots of chances to practice with the icons. Okay. So, we would sit here and we'd say, okay, kids, here's the ethics icon. I might say, why is this ethics icon? Why do you think it's a black and white diamond, right? And lots of folks have replaced it with the scales of justice, which I think maybe makes a little bit more sense. But you can also see that the black and white diamond, talking to kids about it, say, black and white justice isn't always black and white, right and wrong isn't always black and white. So maybe that's why they chose that symbol. So we've introduced the icon and the symbol. We've talked about the connection between the visual and the concept that the visual is pointing to, and then we define it, right? And we add in some keywords so that kids know that we're not just talking about laws, we're also talking about things like values and prejudice and justice and ideology and things like that. And so we've really spent a good chunk of time defining this icon, making sure that kids really understand what ethics means, and that ethics can mean a whole bunch of different things. And once we've done our defining of the icon, then we can tie it to previous knowledge or content. So at this point in the presentation, you in the audience have lots of experience with the story of the animals and the plague. So tying the icon to previous knowledge or content, I might ask my students, okay, so what ethical concerns are created or addressed by the story of the animals and the plague? And then we would have a discussion about it. Maybe we would do some writing. We would do, all kinds of different activities relating ethics back to the story. Maybe even kind of making connections between the story of the animals and the plague and other stories we've read, right? So we want to make it as rich and networked as possible, just in terms of the web of stuff that we provide to kids. And after we've had a really good discussion, maybe done some embedded writing and things like that about the story of the animals and the plague as related to ethics, well, then we would apply it to new content. Okay, so our new content in this case is something called the trolley problem. Okay, so the trolley problem is a classic of moral philosophy. So if you ever had to take kind of a 101 philosophy course in college, or if you've seen The Good Place, the trolley problem, of course, goes something like this. So this trolley here is barreling down the tracks. The brakes are gone. Perhaps the driver is incapacitated or the driver has bailed. So you basically just have this huge machine barreling down the tracks, okay? And if you look down here at the other end of the tracks, you have 5 individuals. We don't know what they're doing in this particular scenario. Maybe they're doing some work on the tracks. Maybe they're just crossing the street. We don't know, all right? But then over here on this other alternate track, there is another individual who is kind of standing there in the same way that these 5 individuals are doing. So you, as the audience member, find yourself in the position of the switch operator, okay? And you have one choice to make. Are you going to do nothing, in which case the trolley will go straight and will ruin the days of these 5 individuals here? Or do you pull the switch, in which case the trolley veers off to the right and this guy has his day ruined? Guy or gal, I should say. We don't know. Okay, so a lot of folks will try to argue with the problem. They'll want to ask questions about the individuals. We want to try to avoid that at first and really just kind of ask, okay, what ethical problem is presented in this new situation. So remember, we tied the ethics icon back to the stories of the animal and the plague. Now the next step in the Kaplan process is to use it with new content, right? So, I don't know if you're going to be using the trolley problem with elementary kids, probably not, but, older kids can probably handle it. What do? What ethical problem is presented in this situation, and how can it be solved? And it really is, a basic moral philosophy problem. Do the needs of the many outweigh the needs or the well-being of the one? Right? So we've applied it to new content. We've had this rich discussion about what we would do, why we would do it, and we're going to come back to the trolley problem in just a second. But then we apply it to the real world. Okay, so we looked at the animals and the plague, then we looked at the trolley problem as our new content. Now what we are going to do is apply it to something happening in the real world, and this kind of goes back to the animals and the plague. So I will admit that this video is from Inside Edition, which I do not necessarily consider a reliable source, but I did look it up in other places to confirm that yes, in fact, the issue that you're going to learn about in this brief video is in fact an issue that folks are thinking about in relationship to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to go ahead and watch this together, and then we'll talk about some of the ethical implications involved.
It comes as the world hit a grim milestone: 1 million COVID-related deaths, 205,000 in the USA. Now, we're learning that in the race to develop a vaccine, sharks may be a key. How so? Shark liver contains a rare oil called squalene, which makes the vaccine more potent. More than 500,000 sharks may have to be captured and sacrificed to supply the world with the coronavirus vaccine. Shark advocates like Stephanie Brendel are concerned.
There will be people wondering why we worry about this, because humans should be more important than sharks, and they are. But we have to remember that there will be many other vaccines, and this will go on potentially for decades, and it will add up.
So we've applied our ethics icon to content that we were familiar with in terms of the animals and the plague. Then we took a look at applying it to some new content in terms of the trolley problem, and we are going to come back to the trolley problem in just a second. But now we're applying it to a real world issue, which is, okay, if we are going to be creating these vaccines, and these vaccines rely on a biological product that comes from sharks, what are the ethical implications that arise in our discussion of what to do about COVID-19 and its potential outside environmental impacts? And we could have a very rich discussion about that. And we could also have an even richer discussion by combining two of our icons. So it's not just what are the ethics involved in using shark oil to create vaccines, but what are the multiple ethical perspectives, right? And which ethical perspective do we need to give the most weight to, right? So obviously there is a need to save potentially millions of human lives via a vaccine, but we also have to ask ourselves, how do we weigh that necessity against the needs of shark populations, which are already quite distressed because of things like overfishing, right? So there's a bunch of different ways to think about combinations of icons, but what I want you to really understand is the process, right? You introduce the icon, define the icon, apply it to previously mastered content, then apply it to new content, and then apply it to the real world. And you can have some very rich, very interesting discussions with your kids about that, right? And you're giving them this practice to really think in higher level ways, to use the rigor of the icons as a way to think about whatever content it is that is mandated that you teach them in more broad, deep, and of course complex ways. So the content itself does not matter. It didn't necessarily have to be a video about sharks. It could have been about any number of other things. The content is of course going to be determined by your own standards and by what is developmentally appropriate for your own kids. So just to review one more time, the process recommended by Sam Kaplan, we introduce one icon a week. We say, kids, this week the ethics icon is going to focus our thinking. Here's what it looks like. Why do we think the icon is the way that it is? Why did they choose that? Then we'll talk about defining that icon. What does ethics mean to you? How do experts define ethics? Are there different definitions? which of those definitions is the best? Are there any conflicting definitions? And then we as a class come up with our own definition of that higher level thinking skill. And then we start applying that higher level thinking skill to content. And the content is whatever you are tasked with teaching based on your TEKS or your standards. So we looked at the animals in the plague because the first thing we're going to do is apply that ethical situation, that ethical icon to previously learned content. So what ethical situation arose in Aesop's The Animals and the Plague? Then we are going to apply that higher order thinking skill to a new set of content. In this case, it was the trolley problem. And then we are going to ask questions about new real world content using that icon. So we looked specifically at sharks, but a broader question might just be, how can you use your knowledge of ethics to make recommendations about how to handle the COVID-19 pandemic? And then we repeat. Okay, so what that might look like, let's take the animals and the plague, right? So we say, okay, we're going to use the ethics icon to focus our thinking this week, and we read the animals and the plague. Maybe that's our new content this time, and we look for all the ethical situation in the animals and the plague. Then the next week we introduce, patterns, right? Well, you can use the patterns icon and read the story again, this time using the patterns icon or whatever other icon you chose to go with next, and keep that content the same. And you are just deepening your understanding of that specific content by using different lenses, right? And we also talked a little bit about how you can combine icons, in this case with the sharks, multiple perspectives and ethics, to have an even richer discussion. So we're going to jump into a little bit more advanced ways of thinking about combining icons right now. So if we look back at the trolley problem, right, so now you're a little bit more familiar with the trolley problem, we're going to use ethics again as our lens to think about the trolley problem. And we can ask a pretty good question about the trolley problem using our ethics icon, which in this case is, what ethical problem is presented in this situation and how can it be solved, right? And there's a number of different ways to solve it. I do want to call your attention to the fact that the question I've asked down here is not a bad question, but there are ways of making it a better question. So we're using just one icon. What happens when we use two icons? Okay, so now our question is, what are the multiple ethical perspectives about what the switch operator should do? Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways of thinking about this problem now, and what we've done is we've combined our ethics icon again with our multiple perspectives icon, and that's allowing us to ask an even more in-depth question, right? But I want you to notice down here what I've underlined. Okay, so it's not just that we're identifying multiple ethical perspectives, and there are a whole bunch that we're going to look at in just a second here, but I'm also adding a higher level question stem, right, to my two icons. So it's not just identify, right? It's not just comprehend the multiple ethical perspectives. We are also asking, okay, what is the best one? All right, so adding that layer of Bloom's taxonomy or depth of knowledge or Costa's, whatever your district uses or whatever you use in your individual classroom, to really up the level of our thinking even again, right? So we're not just looking at one layer with ethics, we're not just looking at even two layers with multiple perspectives, we are now also adding that evaluate level on there. Okay, so if we do sit here and ask, okay, what are the multiple ethical perspectives about what the switch operator should do? There's a whole bunch of different options, right? A lot of people will initially land on the utilitarian perspective because they are pretty intent on doing the greatest good for the greatest many. In which case, if you're using the utilitarian ethic, the switch operator pulls the switch because it is better to ruin the day of one person than it is to ruin the day of 5 people, all right? But it may be that you land on a deontology ethic, which is a rule ethic, which basically says you follow the rules no matter what the consequences are. So maybe it is that as the switch operator, you have to ensure that this trolley gets to 8th Street by 10 a.m. And if you pull the switch, that trolley is going to be on 9th Street at 10 a.m., right? So you have to follow the rule, in which case the 5 individuals here get their day ruined because you have to follow that rule, okay? It may be that these people here are a work crew, but they weren't supposed to start working until later in the day, so they're breaking the rule, right? So a deontology ethic says you focus on doing what is right according to the rules or according to the law, and the consequences essentially be damned. Now, a lot of folks will also kind of ask about the virtue ethic, right? So that's where you want to know a little bit more about the personalities of these people. You know, are these 5 righteous people here? You know, are they on their way to go help the homeless or the hungry? Is this person down here basically a jerk? In which case, you know, you would sacrifice this person here because these 5 here are virtuous, or it may be that these 5 here are on their way from robbing a bank, and this person down here is essentially a saint, in which case you sacrifice the 5 who are morally suspect in order to save the morally virtuous person. A care ethic would ask, okay, who is in the need of most help, right? So if these are 5 hale and hearty young people, and this is a little old man or a little old lady, well, you let the 5 hale and hearty young people fend for themselves, and you help the little old man or the little old lady or the toddler because they are least able to fend for themselves, right? The ethic of relativism would say, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, in which case you maybe don't make any choice, or you just make a random choice. Or egoism, which is, you know, an ethic of what is going to be best for me as a switch operator, in which case you probably pull the switch because you're going to get in less trouble if you take out 1 person than if you take out 5. So we had to, and I want this to be very clear, we have to examine the multiple perspectives before we can decide which is the best one. A lot of times kids will just want to go with their gut on some of these things. You really do have to introduce them to what those multiple perspectives are, or to let them figure out what those multiple perspectives are. We don't want them just going with their gut. They really do have to do the harder brain work of understanding the multiple perspectives in order to land on which of those multiple perspectives ethically they think is most correct or most right. Okay, so that again gets us to the question of what are the multiple ethical perspectives about what the switch operator should do, and what is the best one. Okay, so if we're thinking about a formula for this, a topic, whatever it is, plus a couple of icons will get you a good question. Okay, so if our topic is COVID-19 and our 2 icons are ethics and multiple perspectives, then a good question that comes from combining those 3 things is, what are the multiple ethical perspectives on how the COVID-19 pandemic should be handled? Not a bad question. In fact, a very good question. But if we combine the topic plus 2 icons plus a higher level thinking skill, whether it's Bloom's or Costa's or DOK, then we get an even better question. We get a great question, in fact. Okay, so our topic again is COVID-19. We're going to use our lenses, our icons of ethics and multiple perspectives again, and then we're going to add in the Bloom's thinking skill of evaluate. And so then we ask, which of the multiple ethical perspectives on how the COVID-19 pandemic should be handled has the most compelling evidence to back it up? Okay, so now if you think about the difference between these 2 questions, this is again not a bad question. Kids should be able to answer that question as they're thinking about the topic. But now we have to really examine stuff, and we have to go a little bit further and say, okay, you know, it's not just about what the multiple perspectives are ethically, but we also need to think about evidence, and we need to be able to weigh that evidence and think about, you know, really who has the best case, right? You know, how do we weigh lockdowns with the economy, that kind of thing, right? And there's different ways of talking about it and different debates that could be had. Combining 3 icons will also get you a lot more bang for your buck. So in this case, what we have here is the ethics icon, the multiple perspectives icon again, and then another of my favorite icons, paradox. So what is the best solution to the conundrum posed by the multiple ethical perspectives about what the switch operator should do? Okay, so again, notice we've got 3 icons, we've got multiple perspectives, ethics, and then paradox here is represented by that word conundrum, but we're still asking about the best. We still have that higher level Bloom skill of best, as opposed to just identifying the conundrum. We also want to think about how do we solve it and what's the best way to do it. We can also, and we're going to switch gears, so to speak, here for just a second, we can also think about combining icons to create big ideas. And big idea is something that we're going to spend a little bit more time on here in just a second, because big idea can be very difficult for students to grasp, and it can be very difficult for teachers to frame. But in this case, I've used my 3 icons, ethics, multiple perspectives, and paradox, not to write a question, but to focus my thinking and allow me to synthesize a big idea about this content that is the trolley problem. So if I'm looking through the lens of ethics and multiple perspectives and paradox about the trolley problem, the big idea that I come up with is competing ethical perspectives often lead to morally untenable situations where there is no good solution. And we can think back to that question of the sharks, right? Yes, a vaccine is absolutely fundamental, but we also have to think about what a vaccine made from this particular chemical compound will do to the health of our oceans. And then we must ask, okay, is there another way that we could come up with in terms of synthesizing a vaccine that wouldn't cause such an environmental impact, right? So it's all about refining thinking, it's all about challenging thinking, it's all about making thinking a little bit more rigorous. Right? This takes us to our discussion of big idea. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on big idea because of all of the icons. Big idea is kind of, like I said, the most difficult for both teachers and students to grasp. Okay. And I think part of that stems from the fact that we often want to think about big idea in the same way that we are taught to think about theme in our English classes. Okay. So we will say, you know, the theme of this story is family, or themes of friendship and courage, right? And that may be fine as far as an English class goes, but big idea is asking us to get at something more, okay? And I think that we tend to think about big idea as just sort of being abstract nouns in the way that we also think of literary theme as abstract nouns. But I want to kind of make that ridiculous in a way by saying, you know, I would not say that the theme of this story is octopuses. That is a topic of the story, but that is not a theme. Okay, so a lot of times when kids and teachers are trying to identify big idea, what they are identifying is not big ideas, they are identifying big topics. Okay, all of these things listed here in this grid are big topics. They are abstract, they are important. We should be able to talk about them intelligently, but they are not big ideas. Okay, so a big idea is what a source or a story or, you know, an article is saying about big topics. So big idea is a sentence. So let's take a look at how this might work with something like To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, so if we take the notion that big ideas are sentences, not words, then we can say that a big idea of To Kill a Mockingbird is not justice. Now, is To Kill a Mockingbird is a novel very concerned about justice? Yes, absolutely. To Kill a Mockingbird, as one of its big topics, really is almost obsessed with the big topic of justice, okay? But just saying that the big topic of To Kill a Mockingbird is justice is not enough. What we would say is that a big idea of To Kill a Mockingbird is leadership often means fighting for justice even when you know you won't win, okay? So that's a big idea. A big idea is, what does To Kill a Mockingbird have to say about the topic of justice? So one of the things that you can do is, you know, if you've got your big topics, think about how you might combine these together, right? So give your kids, you know, strips of paper with all of the big topics that you're going to be talking about and have them as a group, you know, try to put them together in a sentence. So you might say something like, leadership means having the courage to value diversity within your community, even when people may be pushing back against that, right? So it's all about combining these big topics into big ideas, okay? So what might that look like in terms of a classroom activity? You know, you're reading To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever novel. I'm not actually a great big fan of To Kill a Mockingbird. It's just one that has a lot of cultural cachet, so we spent some time talking about it. And what I might do is I might assign my kids a frame and I might say, okay, kids, read To Kill a Mockingbird and start pulling out some big topics, right? So as you're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, you notice that To Kill a Mockingbird has a lot to say about the big topic of justice. To Kill a Mockingbird has a lot to say about the big topic of leadership. To Kill a Mockingbird has a lot to say about the big topic of guilt. And then as you're reading, you gather your textual evidence, right, to formulate a big idea about that big topic. And here, you've even got a sentence stem for your kids basically saying, okay, the big idea about the big topic of family in To Kill a Mockingbird is blah, 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 as shown by, and that's where you would have your textual evidence, right? So we formulate big idea through exploration of big topics embedded in whatever our content is. Okay, so what I might have students do is like I said earlier, try to combine at least 3 big topics into one big idea sentence. And when COVID-19 finally goes away, if it ever goes away, you might even do something like a snowball fight. Have all of these big topics on strips of paper, have kids wad them up and throw them, pick them up, do some jigsawing, see how many different combinations of these big topics you can put together into big idea sentences. Okay. Now, how do we come up with big topics in order to synthesize into big ideas? Well, that's where your language of the discipline comes in handy. So that grid that I showed you with love and sin and justice and all of that, those are kind of very humanities words. If you're a math teacher or a science teacher, math terms, formulas, things like that, right? Shapes, all of that stuff. Use your own academic vocabulary as big topics, right? Social studies teachers, names, dates, places, have that be your big topics, and then kids have to synthesize those things into big ideas to make statements about history. Another way of helping kids practice the generation of big ideas is with this thing right here, which is a big idea generator. And so if you click here, it will once again ask you to make a copy. You'll have your very own copy in just a second. There we go. Okay, so what we do here, and we're using it specifically with text. So it would be, whatever, topic you are working on. So it could be a science article, it could be a math problem, it could be anything, right? In this case, we're going to look at some examples for short stories. But what we do first is we start gathering evidence, right? So in this case, we are gathering quotes from the story. And those are our details, okay? So those are kind of the fine points upon which our big idea rests, okay? Because big idea often is just made up of details, and then you synthesize those details into an overarching concept, right? Or a generalization, all right? So we have our quotes. And from our quotes, we pull our big topics. And our big topics, as much as possible, should be one word. And then we think about, okay, so what overall is the article or the source or the story or the poem saying about these big topics? And then we combine it into one big idea. So here, for example, is the animals and the plague again. So I pulled these quotes. And then from those quotes, I pulled the big topics that those quotes are concerning themselves with. And then I come up here and I use those big topics. I turn them into a sentence to generate a big idea. So in this case, my big idea for the animals and the plague is when judgments about sin are rooted in hypocrisy, the rights of the weak are sacrificed. And I also went ahead and did one that was a little bit more secondary. So one of the great stories, one of the great American short stories, Harrison Bergeron, great story to read with gifted kids. So again, I just pulled my quotes down here from the story, and then I pulled out my one-word big topics, and then I thought about it, and I come up with this big idea up here, which is when the powerful make laws to enforce false equality, true fairness is sacrificed. So there's another way of helping kids generate big idea, and it also, of course, acts as a visual, right? So you've got kind of the Parthenon structure here. Well, these big topics are the columns that the roof of the big idea stands on. So at this point, we've spent quite a good deal of time talking about all of these icons and different ways of embedding them in So now we spent a good deal of time talking about all of the different icons and different ways of introducing them. And so now what we need to do is talk about how we deliberately embed the icons in lessons, right? So we're using the icons as lenses, as higher level thinking skills. How do we put them into a learning experience for our students? And it's a fairly simple process, right? The first thing that we have to do is look at the standards. Always, 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 always start with the standards, start with the TEAC, start with your objectives. What by the end of this lesson cycle are my students supposed to know and be able to do, and how can I embed the icons in a way that is going to broaden and deepen and complexify their thinking about the topic that is addressed by the standards. Okay, so you start with the standard. Then you look at your icons and you say, okay, what icons lend themselves to the objective, right? We're trying to match icon as much as possible to the topic at hand, right? So some icons will work better with certain lessons than other icons. We want to be intentional about that. It's not that you couldn't use every icon or every content imperative with pretty much any standard. It's just that some of them are going to make more sense than others, and you have to be cognizant of that. So, using those icons and your Blooms or your DOK or your Costa, whichever your district uses or whichever one you're used to using, you start thinking about, okay, these icons fit with this particular subject. What can I do in terms of combining those icons with a Bloom stem or command word in order to ask higher level questions about the standard or objective? And then you have to think about, how am I going to embed those questions in my lesson throughout? Are they going to be bell ringers? Are they going to be exit tickets? Are they going to be discussion prompts? Are they going to be research topics or debate questions? Writing prompts, things like that, right? So it's all about really the questioning. So let's take a look at what some of that looks like. Let's say that you're a PE teacher, you're a coach, and your topic is baseball. Okay, so is it important for kids to remember the rules of baseball? Yes, obviously it's important for kids to remember the rules of baseball in order for them to successfully play the game of baseball. But if I'm thinking about combining my icon with a higher level Bloom skill, well, look at how much more mileage I can get out of stuff. Okay, so not only remember the rules of baseball, which is important. Kids can't do very much if they don't know stuff or have skills. But now let's think about, okay, why are the rules of baseball the way that they are? Okay, so there's an analysis piece. That's taking it kind of to the middle of the Bloom's pyramid, kind of the bottom of critical thinking, okay? Well, then let's say, okay, you've analyzed the rules. How are the rules of baseball? How did they come to be the way that they are? How have they changed? Why are they the way that they are? Well, now let's take it up even to another level of critical thinking, to the highest level of critical thinking, and say, okay, which rules of baseball are the most fair? Which rules of baseball are the least fair? Okay, so there's that skill there. And then once you've done that critical thinking, we'll turn it into a cycle of creativity and critical thinking by saying, all right, now that you've remembered the rules of baseball, show me that you can comprehend them so that you can successfully play the game. Well, now let's think about why those rules exist. All right, and then let's say, okay, which of these rules are good rules and which aren't? And then turn it into a creative exercise and say, can you come up with a new rule for baseball that would make it more fun or make it more fair or at least make it shorter, right? Where we're not spending 6-7 hours watching a baseball game. Some people like that. Okay, so it's all about, the icons by themselves are powerful tools, but you can really rev them up when you combine them with higher levels of thinking, with Bloom's, Costas, DOK, etc. So here are some examples of what that might look like. I've chosen a very broad topic here, wanted to show some of my world language people some love. So let's say that, I'm the French language and culture teacher. Well, this is my topic very broadly. These are the lenses that I'm going to use to view French language and culture, and then I'm going to take the icons and combine them with a higher level Bloom skill, and lo and behold, here are the essential questions that I would embed throughout my lessons, right? everything from, what are the crucial words or phrases a tourist should avoid using when in France, down here to ethics, which is a little bit more of a historical problem. When do peasants have the right to revolt? Are there any circumstances in which political violence against the aristocracy is morally justified? So taking it in kind of a Marie Antoinette direction there. Here with big idea again. So liberty, égalité, fraternité. I don't know how to pronounce the French. Those are big ideas. Okay, let's explore, or not big ideas. Those are big topics, I should say. So how do you explain the big topics of liberty, equality, and brotherhood to a 5-year-old? What's the big idea about those big topics, right? Here's another one that's probably a little bit more familiar to most of us. Remember learning about the hero's journey. So again, my broad topic is the hero's journey. Then I have my icons as the higher order thinking lenses that I'm going to use to think about the hero's journey. And then I'm going to combine that iconic thinking with my higher level Bloom's, DOK, Costas, etc. And again, here are the essential questions that I would embed throughout my lesson as writing prompts, as debate prompts, bell ringers, exit tickets, etc. That kind of thing. So embedding stuff into lesson plans is actually pretty simple. And if you go back to the very beginning, or almost the very beginning of the slide deck, and look at that sample lesson that those science teachers came up with, that'll give you a pretty good idea of how to do it pretty simply. Okay, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about depth and complexity frames. I don't want to spend too much time on it because those of you who came here for the advanced version of stuff have probably seen frames before. But for folks who maybe are taking this course who are a little bit newer to depth and complexity, I don't want to leave you without at least a quick discussion of frames just because I think that they are a very powerful tool. So it's called a frame because it looks like a frame. And what you do with the frame is it could be digital, it could be paper. You could do it where you give 4 kids chart paper and each of those 4 kids is writing in one of the quadrants about whatever the topic is. So you take your frame, whether it's paper or digital, and you select whatever topic it is the kids are going to be teaching about. Now you could use this as a pre-assessment, as a post-assessment. Doesn't really matter. It's very, very flexible. And again, what I said earlier was that the depth and complexity icons are pretty simple to integrate. The frame is a very simple way of integrating them, and you can get a lot of powerful thinking out of just these 4 quadrants. So I have my frame, whether it's digital or whether it's paper. I put my topic in the middle. In this case, I chose conflict. And then I select icons, right? And I want to understand how my kids think about the origin of conflict. I want to understand how my kids think about the ethics of conflict. And so what I do is I take my icon, I drop it in there, and then I use that icon as a lens to view my topic. And then I write my higher order question, my higher level thinking question about my topic, right? So you select the icon and you write the question, or maybe you select the icon and the kids just kind of do a brain dump. So there's no question here. The kids are just telling you everything they can about the origin of conflict with no real prompt. Maybe you select the prompt and have the kids write the question. Maybe you just let the kids choose the icons and say, okay, kids, the topic is conflict. You choose which icons you want to explore, and then you do your writing that way. Okay, so again, you could give this to kids at the beginning of a lesson cycle and you say, I really want to know what all they know about ethics. And it may be that they don't know very much. Well, think about all of that good material you've got there in terms of evidence. And it wasn't, a multiple choice test. Okay, so here's a more filled out one. Again, the topic is the same. I selected some other icons, and these are the questions that I would be asking of my students with regards to conflict. And I chose conflict just because it's pretty versatile. It obviously shows up in social studies. It obviously shows up in English. It obviously shows up in social emotional learning. And it even shows up a little bit in science if you think about, ethics and things like that. So these are the questions the kids would then be writing their responses, whether it was a pre-assessment or a post-assessment. It gives me as the teacher a whole lot of data that doesn't have to come from a multiple choice test. Okay, one thing that I wanted to show you real quickly was this concept of a digital frame. And there are plenty of freebies out there. Like I said, Lisa Van Gimmert has some for free, but I also set up one just using a very simple Google slide. So I'm going to exit out of here. And again, what you would want is to make sure that your share settings are correct, right? So anyone with the link can edit. And you would send these frames out to individual kids or groups of kids. And you as a teacher can just kind of drag and drop whichever icons you want the kids dealing with. So you could have, maybe one group is dealing with ethics and across the disciplines and trends, and then I don't know, maybe contribution. Another group is dealing with, patterns and convergence and parallel, right? And maybe unanswered questions. And so you just send these out to the groups, you push them out. You can sort of use these icons up here as manipulatives. And all that I really did here was I just downloaded those icons from Jay Taylor. I resized them and put them up here at the top of the frame. And then you can just manipulate them however you want. You can move them around however you want. And it's a really easy way of doing frames digitally so that the kids can still do the activity, but they can also be socially distanced and they don't have to be, all writing on the same chart paper or something like that. So let's get back into presentation mode. One of the things to note is that the content in the middle of the frame can really be almost anything. It doesn't matter. It is going to be specific to whatever it is you are teaching. So it could be an equation, it could be a word problem, it could be a star question that everybody missed, not last year but 2 years ago. It could be a quote, a picture, a graph, a passage, a prompt, anything like that, right? And so you can have it be very open-ended and just say, okay, here's my topic. You guys tell me everything you can about the multiple perspectives on this topic. Or you could have a specific question written. You could have the kids pick their own icons. You can even do it where maybe you've got 4 kids all working on the same frame and they're just, putting their text box in there. But instead of 4 different icons, everybody's working on language of the discipline. So all of these 4 icons here would be language of the discipline. And then after the kids have done their thinking and their writing, they then try to synthesize down here into a 1-sentence big idea. What's the big idea about the language of the discipline regarding whatever our topic was? Okay, so here's an example that teachers made. So again, as a group, we were doing a professional learning opportunity at Region 11. The topic was the animals and the plague. So everybody had read the animals and the plague. And then I let teachers in groups of 4 work on their own frame. They selected their icons or their content imperatives. And then these are examples of the questions that teachers came up with regarding the story using those icons and content imperatives as their reading lenses. Okay, so I wanted to talk briefly about Emojicons. This is an idea that I borrowed from Ian Bird, and he borrowed it from somebody else. But we talked a little bit at the beginning about how the depth and complexity icons were ahead of their time because they sort of anticipated the visual culture that so many of our students use now. So students communicate in emojis, they communicate in GIFs, they communicate in little short bursts of information via TikTok and things like that. So the depth and complexity icons really were ahead of their time. And one of the things that you can do to make them a little bit more fun and give the kids a little bit more ownership over them is to incorporate, in addition to the original icons, some emoji icons. Okay, so what that looks like is something like this. And I'll tell you, I use the Tweemoji ones just because they're open source. And what I did was I kind of thought about these different thinking skills, right? And then I aligned them with an emoji, right? So if you hit make a copy here, that will take you to a version of these Emojicons, as always, waiting on the make a copy. And There's a couple of different things here. Um, this first set here, these are just thumbnails that have been grouped and they can be edited. So if you don't like the emoji that I selected for the thinking skill, you can feel free to change it by just downloading the open files from tweemoji.twitter.com and select your own icons. Or really better yet, have the students select their own icons, okay? The next thing here, these are flattened, which means that they can be resized, and that's important because if you're wanting to set up one of those editable frames, which is what I've done here, you can again sort of put them down here as the manipulatives, right? And this is a little bit different setup for a frame, but it's the same concept, right? You have your icon, you have your question, you have your topic, and then here is where the kids would embed their writing about that topic, right? So it's just another way of doing it. There is something to be said for the fact, okay, like all I've done here is just change the images. What is the advantage of using Emojicons? Well, number one, like I said, it does give the kids a little bit more ownership and makes it a little bit more fun. But, these are basically just the same thing as static icons. So what I want to show you now is rather than just kind of copying and pasting these things, which you can do from the version that I gave you on that make a copy button, what we really want to do is think about how we might embed them, okay? So here is our frame again. Here is our topic, conflict. How do we embed our emojicons? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit out again. All right, and what I'm going to do is set up a text box. We'll go ahead and make that a different color so that you can read it. And what I would do as a teacher is I might say, here's my question. I'm going to ask kids to evaluate the most important, and then I want to embed my icon this way. So I'm going to come over here to insert, and I'm going to come down to special characters. And then where it says symbol, I'm going to come over to emoji. And let's just say that maybe I want to recreate the flower for details. Well, I can do that, and I can search for flower, and there's different versions of the flower, but I know for a fact that there's a better one. So I'm going to choose rose. And there's something more akin to the actual icon. So evaluate the most important details of Lincoln's, and I cannot type when people are watching me, even if you are not doing this live, of Lincoln's Gettysburg address, right? So the kids can embed their own icons. There's another way of doing it where if the kids kind of want to make up their own, you can do the same thing. So insert special character, and then where it says draw a symbol here, you can kind of think, okay, what symbol am I interested in putting in there? And let's say like I'm thinking about rules, so I want to embed rules, and I think that a good icon for rules would be a crown. So I try to draw a crown, and lo and behold, there it pops up. So that's another fun way of doing it. I will warn you, sometimes the drawing works really well and sometimes it doesn't. The kids just kind of have to play trial and error with it. So those are the Emojicons, just a way of making the icons more flexible, of kind of even more so speaking in the kids' native language of visual culture. And as a bonus, I have also provided you with some Emojicon icon cards. So if you click here, once again, making a copy for your very own, give it a second. And what you have are these question cards that you could use. They have, the Emojicon and the higher level thinking skill, and then they have some of these broader questions. So I went ahead and did these cards for all of the icons and the content imperatives, but then I wanted to show you down here that I also went ahead and added 4 new emojicons, and these are aligned to Carol Ann Tomlinson's, I should say, 4 parallels. So you, in addition to your 11 icons of depth and complexity and your content imperatives, now also have these parallels of the core, and the core is sort of what is the content that we are talking about, what is the basics, what's the stuff that's most important. Then we talk about, okay, how does this content connect across disciplines, across times, regions, cultures, that kind of thing. How do experts talk about and interact with this content? And then finally, the last parallel is identity, which is how does this content impact me as a person? How does it impact my community? How does it impact how I think about myself? How does it impact people who are not like me? What's the moral weight? So I went ahead and added some more icons, just because I really think that these are some great higher level thinking skills as well. So that's just a fun little bonus for you. The next thing I want to talk very briefly about is this way of thinking about not just in terms of depth and complexity, but also of breadth. So here what I have is this activity called the magic mushrooms. And yes, I am aware of how that sounds, and I'm cool with it. So I like to think about breadth, depth, and complexity metaphorically as a patch of mushrooms in a yard or a field. Okay, so if you know anything about mushrooms, you don't really see, much like icebergs, you don't really see the whole complex, right? You only see a little bit of the surface. Okay, so what I would have kids do, and if you click here, you can make your own copies once again. What I would do here is I would say, okay, here's discipline 1. So let's maybe say that this is social studies, okay? And it's very broad, all right? And this is discipline 2, and this is maybe English. And you could, narrow it down a little bit and say maybe this is romantic literature, and maybe this is like the Civil War, okay? So not super, super related, but you can make some connections between them, okay? So I would have kids start with identifying all of the broad topics under a single discipline or under a subset of that discipline. So over here, I'm doing my social studies. Over here, I'm doing English. I'm listing all of the major topics and basic skills that I can think of. And that's the breadth, right? So that is the mushroom cap. Okay, so that's important, right? Kids should know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff, all right? But then we get to depth, right? And when we're thinking about depth, that is going into a specific area of a discipline, all right? So we're not just talking about social studies, we're talking specifically about primary sources, all right? We're not just talking about English language art, we're talking specifically about autobiography, all right? And so then we sit here and think, okay, here's the really broad stuff. Here's where we start to drill down, and this is the mushroom stock, okay? So here I would have kids, listing specific expertise and detail about a single topic or skill, okay? And it may be that, your major big topic here is World War I, and this one over here is World War II. If you're keeping it a little bit more specific, all right, well, this may be World War I weaponry, and this may be World War II weaponry. And so that's the stalk of the mushroom holding up the cap. But then if you know anything about fungus, underneath the surface, right, all of the different toadstools and stuff are actually connected by a network of mycelium, right? So all of these mushrooms, all of the broad topics standing on the stalks of depth, right, are connected underneath. And so this is where I would ask kids to really explore, okay, how are these topics interrelated, all right? So that's a good way of making kids start to make those connections, all right? And again, you can make a copy of your own right here. Try it out with your kids. Try it with yourself. Think about the different things that you teach. How would you drill down and then make connections of complexity about the depth of these broad topics? This is just sort of a way of thinking about how a lot of this stuff fits together. I put this together just as a way of thinking about all the different ways that we might enrich curriculum. So what we have here is a thinking triangle. So, based on the work of Gallagher and Asher and their question taxonomy, so a memory question down here is going to be something like who, what, when, where, all right? And it's going to be tied to skills as a beginner or a novice in the discipline. We don't want to skip memory, though. Memory is, of course, the base that holds the whole pyramid up. I don't like the phrase, if you can Google it, then it's not a very good question. That may be sort of true, but think about how much energy you don't waste Googling when you just know a lot of stuff, okay? So your memory, your comprehension stuff is going to connect to this question over here of what must I know and be able to do, what do I want to know, and how will I know when I know it? And then it also connects over here to Carol Ann Tomlinson's parallel of the core. And these are the ways that the different icons align. So we go from memory to convergent. Convergent is written at about the middle level of Bloom's why or how, so kind of the analysis question. And that's based on the skill level of a novice or a practitioner. Once we get from memory and convergent, we can then get up into the higher levels of critical thinking with evaluative questions, so good, bad, best, worst. And this is where we start talking about being experts or eminent folks in our field, so not just an expert, but an expert that other experts look up to. And then finally, after we've done our critical thinking, we can get up here into the divergent or the speculative questions with, what if? So we don't want to skip memory and convergent. Kids, gifted kids in particular, can do magic tricks with their minds, but it's important to give them the rabbit and the hat, and I feel like memory and convergent constitute the rabbit and the hat in this case. But you can just sort of see how all of this stuff fits together. So just by way of example, a memory question would be in 1492, who sailed the ocean blue? Well, of course, that was Columbus. That's not a trick question. A convergent question that aligns to these icons and these parallels would be something along the lines of, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Why did he do that? Right? So we're having to put some facts together to arrive at a more correct answer. And you could even sort of kick up that convergent question just a little bit into the evaluative realm by saying, okay, well, of the 3 G's that we all learned, gold, glory, and God, which was the most important? And then from evaluative, we get into like real evaluative, like so in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Was that a good or a bad thing? And then we get up from the critical thinking into the creative thinking, which is, okay, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. What if he hadn't? What if he'd come earlier? What if he'd come later? What if he had, but he'd been a nicer guy? His motivations were different. What if somebody else had come? So you can sort of see how all of these gifted skill sets and all of these gifted enrichment tools come together in this, what I'm calling the integrated enrichment pyramid. Okay, so we're going to leave behind some of the academic stuff, and we're going to look now at some of the ways in which depth and complexity can be used as a social emotional tool. So I'm calling this the icons and imperatives of feeling. I don't think it's the best title, but it's the one that I came up with. And what I want to show you and walk you through is the ways in which these depth and complexity icons and content imperatives can be a way for us to focus our thinking about social and emotional learning, and as a way for helping kids to process emotions. I am not a big believer in the notion that gifted kids are more more socially or emotionally frail than the general population. I don't think that the evidence is good for that, but I do think that the icons of depth and complexity can be very useful for helping GT kids process their emotions in a higher level way to bring them to good outcomes. So what I've set up here is essentially just a slide deck, and what I've done is I've taken the icons, and then just like we did with the academic stuff, I used those icons as a lens through which to view a social emotional issue. Okay, so in this case, language of the discipline would have me, if I'm helping a kid process something as a teacher or a counselor, I would ask the kid, hey, can you give a specific name to the feeling beyond the basics, right? So we all know kind of, the big three: happy, sad, mad. But can you, say what kind of sad you are? Are you really despairing, or are you just disappointed, right? So giving kids the emotional vocabulary to talk more deeply about their feelings can be very, very powerful. Then we look at details, okay? So, we all know what feelings feel like. We all know when we have big feelings, but are there ways of maybe breaking it down a little bit so that we can ask, okay, what is my inner voice saying when I'm feeling this way? What's my self-talk, okay? What images are in my head? What am I feeling physically, right? It's not just in my head. Am I having a somatic reaction to something, okay? And then we get into patterns. When does this feeling tend to occur during the day? Are there things that trigger it, right? So if you have a kid who has a history of acting out right after lunch, can you help them identify the patterns of conversations or behaviors or anything like that that might lead them to that negative outcome emotionally or socially? Then we get into rules. Okay, so you're allowed to feel your feelings. Okay, and I think that that's important for us to talk about with kids. Is like your feelings are pretty much always valid, but the ways in which you act on your feelings may be more or less inappropriate given the situation. So, you may be feeling down, but that doesn't give you the right to take X action. So let's process that and say, okay, you feel this way, and that is a valid way for you to feel. Nobody is telling you not to feel that way. But let's talk about what good reactions to feeling that way are, right? We don't yell, we don't scream, we don't throw things, but we're still allowed to feel angry, right? So when I feel this way, how can I express it in a way that isn't going to impinge on the rights of others or, endanger others or make others feel bad, okay? So what is and is not all right to do when you are feeling a certain way? Trends, okay? This is a good one, I think, for gifted kids. And again, I don't think that gifted kids are necessarily super prone to existential depression, but I have had some anecdotal, experience with that where, yeah, there were kids that were thinking really, really hard about the world and were then kind of getting themselves into a pretty black hole, a pretty dark place. So helping them identify them. Are there things going on in the world which I can't control contributing to this feeling? All right, whether that is on a local scale or at home or on a global scale. Obviously, things are very, very stressful for everybody right now. So, helping kids identify some of those outside influence and then really helping them understand what they can and can't control. No, you aren't necessarily going to be able to solve the COVID-19 pandemic because you are 10 and the adults are not doing a so great job about that right now. But maybe you can organize something like a food drive or a donation drive to help people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19, to kind of give them back some control over that feeling of helplessness. All right. What if you don't know why you're feeling the way that you're feeling? Has everybody's probably woken up on the wrong side of the bed and they really couldn't name why it is that they were grumpy or grouchy. Is there a way that you can process it? Who can you talk to about how you're feeling and maybe come to the bottom of it, figure it out? Ethics, all right? This is such an important one, okay? Is there anybody who owes me an apology, all right? What am I owed in order to make the situation better? But also, do I owe anybody an apology? And then really, asking kids, why is it okay to feel what I feel, right? Letting them know that, yeah, maybe you did something bad, maybe you broke a rule, but the way that you feel is still valid, okay? It's the actions connected to the feeling that we have to work on. Big idea, just some sort of self-reflective practice, some meditative practice. If I had to sum up how I've been feeling lately, what would I say and why would I say it? So, if you're going to do stuff like circle up or class meetings, this is a good question to ask all the kids, really think about the last week, think about the last month, think about the last semester. How are you doing? How's life going for you, right? Like, can you put a name to it? if you have had an issue in terms of behavior, all right, like, how much time do I need to calm down or process or regroup? Is it going to take me some time to forgive a person who has maybe wronged me, right? How much time do I need, right? We don't ever want to force kids into forgiveness, right? They are allowed to process it as they want, and they're allowed to withhold forgiveness as well. I think that's important to acknowledge, right? And then how might I feel later? Can you sort of see to the other side of how you were feeling? This is an important one as well. Let's be reflective about how our actions impact others, right? So if I've done something wrong, how has that impacted other people? But then also thinking, right now it maybe looks hopeless, but what do you think you might feel tomorrow? What do you think your future self would say about how you're feeling right now? That's not to say that we want to force kids into feeling differently than they do. We need to let them sit with their feelings. We need to acknowledge those feelings. But we also want to give them as much perspective as possible in a respectful way. Um, Across the disciplines, this one was a little bit rougher, but who can best help me deal with my feelings? Is it going to be, a parent? Is it going to be a friend? Is it going to be the teacher? If it's just like a little, blip on the radar, you as a teacher can deal with it. Or maybe you need to bring out somebody with a little bit more training, like the school counselor, like the psychologist, that kind of thing. Contribution. Okay, so let's talk about why I acted the way that I did. If I acted poorly, what factors contributed to how I feel the way I acted, and then how much of that am I responsible for, right? So your feelings again are valid. What you are responsible for is the way that you act in reaction to those feelings, right? If there is an issue of forgiveness, if there is an issue of having been wronged, what is the process for reconciliation going to look like? What conditions are going to make forgiveness possible? Origin, what sparked this feeling or this behavior? And then if there was a problem behavior, how might I handle it differently next time? And then what if I feel conflicted about something? What if I feel both, whatever and whatever at the same time? How do I integrate those feelings so that I can process them and move on? So just a very brief discussion of the flexibility of the depth and complexity icons. You can see that they really do work extremely well across a bunch of different disciplines, including some of the, not just the brain work, but also the heart work. I don't want to spend, here's also parallel. I almost forgot about parallel. Are there others who felt or feel the same way as me, and what can I learn from them? How did they process things? How did they get over the hump? Right. I also want to point out that you can use the depth and complexity icons. If the previous slides were about dealing with negative behavior, you can also use depth and complexity as a way of goal setting and coaching. So coaching is a values-based and goal-oriented collaborative process that seeks deep solutions to complex problems. You see what I did there? Via presuming positive intent, committed listening, reflective feedback, and powerful questioning. So I'm not going to do what I did with the previous slides on the icons and imperatives of feelings, but I am going to kind of click through here. And what you'll see here, again, you are using the icons and the imperatives as lenses for tackling problems and for setting goals. So these lenses are helping you as a coach of kids or of staff frame questions in such a way that the person you're coaching or speaking with or helping set goals is finding their own solutions. So I'm just going to click through these slowly. I'm not going to say very much, but you kind of get the idea. So not just as a way of dealing with maybe poor behavior, but of also fostering positive behavior and growth mindset and things like that. So here's language of the discipline. Here's details, and feel free to pause and slow down as you need to. It may be that you were just here for the academic stuff and you're going to skip through all of this, and that's totally fine too. Here's patterns. Here's trends. Here's rules. Here's unanswered questions. Here we have ethics. This is a very important one for goal setting because ethics, asks us not just to set a goal that will benefit us, but also ask how the process for meeting that goal will impact others, whether it's going to be good or bad. And if it's going to be bad, we need to think about maybe reframing that goal or thinking about a different way of achieving it. Here's a big idea. This can be great for PBL too, as you can kind of see. So, thinking about whatever project or problem you're trying to solve, like what do we visualize as the end being, keeping the end in mind as we proceed. Change over time. Multiple perspectives, another great one, especially for group work. One of the things that it's important to note is the way that these are framing the questions, not just, tell me your plan, but also assuming that there is a plan, right? So you're assuming that the person you're coaching, you're assuming that the person who you are helping set goals wants to do their very best. Here's across disciplines. Contribution, we're into the content imperatives now. Convergence, origin, and then paradox, and finally parallel. So again, just looking at the diverse ways in which you can use all of the icons. They are very flexible. You can use them obviously in academic disciplines, but they can also be used for any number of other paths and issues and things like that. So at this point, I have said all that I have to say about what I was going to say. Thank you so much for your kind attention to this video. I hope it gave you a lot of new tools and a lot of things to think about. My name is Clint Rodriguez, and I am really looking forward to seeing everybody for the virtual face-to-face portion of this at GiftED20. In the meantime, as you are kind of wrapping up your remote learning for today, please consider connecting with me over social media. I am a huge Twitter person. I love Twitter, and you can find me on Twitter at CTRodGT. I do not speak for Region 11 in any way, shape, or form from that particular account. That is a personal professional account, but if you want to follow me, I do tend to follow back. If you would like to learn more about me or see some of the other stuff that I work on in my spare time, you can visit my personal website at www.ctrodgt.com. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, if you just want to shoot the breeze about anything related to gifted and talented education, by all means, feel free to email me at clintonrodriguez@gmail.com. So for Twitter, it's ctrodgt. For my personal website, and there is a blog on there that occasionally I update, it is ctrodgt.com. And email me at clintonrodriguez@gmail.com. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing everybody in a couple of months here at the GiftED20 virtual conference.